All right, hi everybody. As I mentioned, my name is Tor Mitchell, and today I'm going to talk a bit about product management. Before we kick off, a couple of things. One is, you'll notice we're videoing this. This is something I do every time I do this presentation. It helps me to watch it back later and figure out places where it can be improved, but I do also put it up online. So feel free to ask questions as we go along, but just be aware if you do, your voice will be on the table. If you're not comfortable with that, just ask questions at the end, because I don't include those when I post it. Also, this presentation is a variation of one that I've been giving at a number of different universities, normally to audiences that are more, say, careers focused, people trying to figure out what kind of career they might want in technology. I've heavily modified it today to tailor to the audience, so I apologise if it's a little bit rough around the edges. This is the first time I've done this particular version. And you'll see some of that kind of careers focus like creep in occasionally, so just bear with me. All right, first question, is my clicker going to work? Yes, okay. So a little bit about me. I think we've covered the essentials, but basically I studied physics a long time ago for 4 years, and while I was studying physics, I got a summer job working at an internet service provider in my hometown, which is Bournemouth, back in ¡95, before the internet had really taken off. Quickly realised this was an interesting thing, more interesting to me than physics. So when I graduated, I got a job with a company called Sun Microsystems, that you may have heard of. They were a big workstation and internet software provider in the late 90s and early 2000s. They did extremely well in the dot-com explosion, and they did extremely badly in the dot-com collapse. And I was there all the way through. Which was quite an experience. Spent a bit of time with them in the States as well, in Silicon Valley, and then returned home in 2006 to join Google. And I was with Google for 9 years, a year and a half in the UK, 5 years in Sydney, Australia, and 2.5 years in Mountain View, California. And while I was at Google, I moved from more of an engineering role to a product manager role, and I'm going to explain a little bit about what that means as we go along today. And then about 2 years ago, decided it's time to come home and do something new, and I joined Crowdcube. And Crowdcube are an equity crowdfunding startup based down in Exeter, of all places, in Devon. And we essentially help companies raise finance as an alternative or alongside VCs and angel investors through more of a Kickstarter-style crowdfunding model. But rather than just getting a product when it's done, as you would on Kickstarter, you actually become a shareholder, you actually get equity in the company. So it's an interesting company that gets to work with a lot of interesting startups all over the UK and build some really interesting products as we go along. So why am I here? What brings me here? So one of the first things I was asked to do when I joined Crowdcube was build a product team. That is a team of product managers. At the time, there was one product manager at the company. They were relatively junior, and so they needed to bring in a full-blown team. And I was keen that this team include both a couple of experienced people and someone perhaps who's more of a graduate or entry-level position. I'd worked alongside graduates at Google who were in their associate product management program, which is their graduate training and recruitment program for product managers, and they were phenomenal. They've just had such potential. So I was really keen to try and replicate that. But I really struggled to fill that position. Because despite the fact that I think it's a really interesting role, there was just a real lack of awareness amongst undergraduates and graduates in the UK as to what product management is, why it's interesting, why you might want to do it. And after hitting this brick wall repeatedly, and various other kind of red flags that occurred at events and things, I decided something had to be done. So I started this side project to try and raise awareness of product management. That's all very well and good, you might say. But what's the relevance to you? This is an entrepreneurial society. You're not looking to decide what to be when you grow up. So why is product management relevant to entrepreneurs? Well, the reason is that product management and running a company or being the CEO of a company have a huge amount of overlap. Essentially, you'll hear some people call product managers the CEO of the product. And as a result, what you tend to find is that a lot of product managers, once they've got experience, will go on to found companies. They'll become entrepreneurs. That's very common. You'll also find that a lot of entrepreneurs will found companies. Those companies will do well. They'll be acquired. And that person will therefore be brought into the acquiring company as a product manager. So even if you don't want to be a product manager, you may find yourself being one, whether you like it or not. The last scenario, which is important, is what you tend to find is that when an entrepreneur starts a company, they have an idea, they have a vision, they have something they want to achieve, and they are effectively the first product manager of that company, and they fulfill that role for several years normally, until the product starts to get momentum, they find product market fit, and then other things start to get in the way, like raising finance and hiring an executive leadership team and events and various other things. And they begin to struggle to keep up with what needs to be done on the product side. And that's the point at which they tend to bring in people like me to build product teams to manage the development of the product from that point onwards. So even if you don't end up becoming a product manager, it's still good to understand who we are and what we do, because you'll almost certainly run into us at some point in your career. Okay. So the basic shape of the presentation, it looks like this. So explaining what a product manager is, that will probably, to be honest, be the bulk of the presentation, because part of that includes a case study where we talk about a particular product I launched and what that involved, and why you might want to be a product manager and how do you become a product manager. So I've deliberately, and this comes back to what I was saying a minute ago, trimmed those last two sections down a little bit because I think they may be a little less relevant to you, in order to make more room for digging into the day-to-day activities of a product manager. But I've left a little bit in there just in case I pique your interest and you feel like this may be something you would be interested in learning more about later. Okay, let's kick off. So before we start, there's one sort of key distinction I just want to make, which is when I talk about product managers, and in fact when most people talk about product managers, or when you look into product management as a discipline online, what they're really talking about is digital product management. So product management in technology companies. Product management as a discipline is relatively young. It really arose around 10 or so years ago. And it's beginning now to seep out of the technology space into other sectors, like consumer goods and hardware and so forth. It's a little bit different in those scenarios, and it's not something I've had experience of, so I don't feel qualified to speak about that in detail. We're really talking about technology companies here. Okay. So before we start, kind of obvious, before you talk about product managers, you have to decide or define what a product is. When I talk about product, I'm meaning any piece of hardware, piece of software, or service that's offered either to consumers or businesses. Very broad definition. Could be anything from an app on your phone, to a Hoover, to an event you're running, anything at all that you would sort of conceptually perceive as being a product that's offered. Okay, so what you'll find is that in modern technology companies, every product has a product manager, and the product manager's role is to ensure or own the success of that product. It's as simple as that. It's a very broad definition, quite deliberately. So their job essentially is to figure out what this product should be, how is it going to benefit users and the business, deliver it, and then make it successful. And it's really up to you as the product manager to figure out what needs to be done to achieve that. But there are certain key responsibilities that are common across the board. So one analogy I like to use is it's a bit like being the conductor of an orchestra. Because the thing about product managers is we don't build products, we don't code, and, we don't design. We are essentially a coordination function. In the same way that a conductor, for example, doesn't play an instrument, but he decides what music should be played, and then coordinates all the musicians to deliver a great experience for the audience, the product manager doesn't build the product, but coordinates all the functions necessary to deliver a great experience for the user. Now, the funny thing about product management is that it's the only role that's really involved with the product from the very, very beginning all the way to the very, very end. So from the point of conception to the day you decide this product should no longer be offered in the market and kill it off. And that process sort of breaks down into a few key steps. So obviously the first thing is the idea. Where do ideas come from? How do you decide if an idea is worth pursuing? And it's a common misconception that product manager's job is to come up with ideas. And that's not true. In fact, if you're a product manager and you think that's your responsibility, you're not doing a very good job. Because actually, the goal of a product manager is to collect ideas. It's to listen to customers, it's to listen to colleagues, it's to listen to engineers, it's to listen to marketing. It's to synthesize all the feedback that's coming from all those parties together, look for patterns, recognize opportunities, and then put together proposals for products that the company should develop. And then build a case, and then get approval to go ahead. So a key part of that is research. And what I mean by research is those conversations, going out there and talking to your potential customers, your users, your audience, understanding what it is they need, what are the pain points they're suffering from, what incentives are they operating under, how do you ensure that you're going to build a product that actually is compelling in the market. And there's a variety of ways of doing that. There's a whole spectrum that starts with one-on-one conversations, all the way through focus groups, through surveys, right up to kind of conferences and things like that. So there's lots of different ways you can talk to your audience, but what you tend to find is that the companies that do well are the ones that invest very, very heavily in research and don't make the mistake of assuming they know what their customers want. Okay, so you've got an idea, you've done the research, you've validated that there's an opportunity here, now you have to design the product. And when we talk about design, it can mean a variety of different things. There's obviously what you might instinctively think of as design, which is what does this product look like? What is the user experience? But actually that's a bit further down the pipe. First you have to think about what the journeys are. Like how are you going to take someone through the process of using your product and achieving their goals? And only when you figure out what the journeys are can you do the interaction design, start thinking about the user interface, and then the visual design where you actually polish that up and make it look good and make it look intuitive and add a bit of whimsy and make it fun. So obviously product managers are not designers. You have designers on your team, but they look to you, the product manager, to define the requirements. What is it this product is going to try and achieve or offer? And what do they need to accommodate within the design? Also, they look to you for a direction as to whether they're going the right way with the design, because you're essentially the user advocate. You're representing the person who's going to use this product and what their expectations are. So what you tend to find is designers will have a bunch of different ideas which they'll prototype, and they'll come to you and say, what do you think? And between you, you discuss which one feels like the right solution for your users. Once you have a design, then we can actually go ahead and start building it. So that's where your engineering team gets involved. And again, you're not coding, but you're there all the way through the process, providing guidance and doing what I like to call the maker of trivial decisions. So what you tend to find when you're developing a product is that there are the broad, big, important decisions about the basic look and feel and the functionality. There are also all these tiny little decisions that come up all the time that might seem inconsequential, but if someone doesn't make that decision, everything just grinds to a halt. What should the label on this button be? What colour should that panel be? What's the language that we're going to use to communicate a particular concept? These are the sorts of things which developers may not feel comfortable unilaterally making that decision, but someone has to, and as a product manager, and you're the person that they will turn to for advice. Okay, and at the end, you have to launch the product, and launching a product is actually a whole exercise in and of itself. You need to understand what your go-to-market strategy is. How are you going to communicate this launch? How are you going to communicate the benefits of your product to your potential audience? How are you going to raise awareness of it? What do you need to do in terms of documentation? Is your product compliant with any regulations that you might be subject to? So there's a whole raft of considerations that you need to worry about when it comes to launching a product. And your job as the product manager is to coordinate all of that and make sure that all the different organisations within the company who have a stake in this launch, who care about it, are satisfied and are prepared to go ahead. Okay, so as I say, there's your kind of basic sequence, and you're a key part of that whole process from start to finish. One thing I want to stress though, if it's not obvious already, is product managers don't manage people. So you don't have organisational authority over any of these people. It's a role built on influence. You have to basically build a case for why the company should build the product you're suggesting. You have to build a case for why you believe that certain designs are the right designs, or certain decisions you're making during development are the right decisions. And the audience that you have within those conversations will expect you to bring a justification. They'll expect you to back your arguments by data and build a relationship with them where they trust you understand the problem and you understand the rationale behind why it should work a certain way. So relationship building is absolutely critical to being a successful product manager. Okay. So I just want to play a very short video clip. Part of this project I've been doing has involved speaking to successful product managers and asking them some basic questions about why they enjoy the role and how they got into it and why they would recommend it as a career. And this is one I particularly like and I picked out. This guy, I wouldn't expect you to recognise him, but his name is Marty Caden. and he is very highly respected in the global product management community. He was an early product manager at Netscape, who were like the original browser company. And then he went on and was a very senior at eBay for a long time. And now he runs essentially a consultancy business in the States, helping companies build effective product teams. He also does training and various other things. And I had the chance to meet him last year, and I sat down and I asked him a few questions. And this is one of the things he said. Hopefully, you'll be able to hear this.
It's an amazing job. And I think there's a very strong argument to say it is the most important non-executive position in a company. It's really second only to the CEO. And that is, you can say that about a lot of jobs, and a lot of people have found that this is not only a great job and a great career, but it's a proving ground for eventually starting their own company. In fact, a lot of the best investors out there will only invest in someone who has proven they can be a product manager successfully.
So, you might say, well, you would say that. But actually, if you look at the background of a lot of kind of very successful entrepreneurs, particularly in the US, you find that many of them started out as product managers, or at least did a stint as a product manager before they got into starting their own company. Also, you find a lot of senior executives have a product management background. The current CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, he started out at Google as a product manager. The current CEO of Yahoo, Marissa Mayer, she started out as a product manager. The current CEO, the founder and CEO of Instagram, started out as a product manager. So there's a definite relationship here between product managers and entrepreneurship. Okay, so I mentioned that we're going to work through a case study, and this is new, so bear with me. As I mentioned, I get feedback on these presentations when I give them, and one of the pieces of feedback I've been having consistently is that people were interested in hearing a real life story about a product I managed and what was involved in doing that. And so I've added this new section which talks about a particular launch that I managed that I thought was interesting and it's a good fit for this kind of talk. And we're going to work through that now and kind of the story of a single product. In reality, it's not actually the story of a product, it's the story of just one feature of a product. Because it turns out that even when you launch a product, that product isn't done. No product is ever done when it's launched. That's just V1. And you're always continually refining it and improving it. And as the product manager, you have to figure out, well, what should we do next? What's the next thing we can do that will have the most positive impact on the success of this product and the goals of this product? So I'm going to talk about style maps. And I'll explain what that means as we go along. But we'll start with a bit of background. When I was at Google in Australia, I spent several years managing a product called the Google Maps API. Now, you may have heard of this if you've done any web development, but if not, I'll just sort of fill you in. Obviously, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Google Maps. But you've also probably noticed that Google Maps turns up in all sorts of unexpected places. It turns up on websites that are not Google websites. And other sites like hotels.com use a Google map and then put their own data on top. And this is used in all sorts of creative ways. There are well over 1 million websites worldwide who are actively using this product. And the Maps API is the set of developer tools that allow web developers to do this. And you'll see a really wide range of complexity in these different API applications, from very simple ones that just put a single pin somewhere on the map and say this is where the hotel is, to websites that do really intricate things with elevation profiles, figuring out cycling routes, and various other things. So this is just one example that I pulled up a few days ago. So I was managing this product, before I get stuck into what the feature was, it's important to understand just some basics about how it works. So basically, the Maps API inherits a lot of functionality, shares a lot of code actually with the Google Maps website, with maps.google.com, including the map itself. So probably don't think too heavily about it, but the map itself, at least at that time, was a set of images, unsurprisingly. And those images are delivered in little chunks. We don't send you the whole image, we send you it in pieces, because that allows us to just send you the bits you need for the view that you have at a given moment in time. And these little pieces are called tiles, and they're square, and it starts with all the way out, the whole world on a single tile. Looks like that. When you go in one level, the size of the map doubles. So now the whole world fits on 4 tiles. When you go in one more, it doubles again. Now the whole world fits on 16 tiles, and so on and so on. At the time that I was working on this product, there were about 17 zoom levels, which if you do the maths, works out at about 23 billion tiles. Now the reality is that there's some optimizations you can do to avoid spending a lot of time drawing empty ocean and empty deserts. You're still looking at, probably 4 billion or so tiles with content on. Okay, so the way that those tiles obviously have to reflect the world, and the world is constantly changing. So how did Google make sure that you were seeing a current map? Well, the answer was they had this enormous database, custom database, that contained all the mapping data that they had aggregated or licensed or collected of all sorts of different types. It could be anything from a road, to a business, to a mountain. They had a massive database with all that information in. And every few weeks, they would run a huge job that would spit out an updated tile set. And that job would take hours. I mean, hours and hours and hours, which at Google is pretty surprising. Not many things at Google take hours and hours and hours. And they would spit out this massive tile set, and then that tile set would be copied to every data center that serves Google Maps. And which, again, just if you think of how long it takes to download 23 billion images, was a fairly hefty job that they had to run every couple of weeks to just distribute it across the data centers. And then when you made a request using Google Maps, your browser would request a specific list of tiles, and the data center would just serve them out of cache very, very quickly. So that's a kind of heavyweight process, but it's sort of natural, makes sense, and works reasonably well. But there was a problem, and the problem was that Google kept finding that there were reasons why they needed to show a slightly different map to different people. So, for example, one is disputed borders. This is an area in the north of India, where India, Pakistan, and China meet. This is what the map looks like if you're in India. This is what it looks like if you're in China. India, China, India, China. So you can see that the border between India and China changes depending on who's asking. And in the US, it looks like this, which is basically, like it's disputed, so we'll put some dotted lines on it. So it might seem a little thing, but this is hugely sensitive. If you get this wrong, you will not be allowed to offer maps in that country, right? You'll be in a lot of trouble. Tiny border issues have caused no end of problems. There's actually a case, I meant to look it up, where one country accidentally invaded another country because they believed the borders on Google Maps and they were slightly wrong. So this is really sensitive stuff. You don't get this wrong. So the solution is, well, actually we'll come to that. There's another reason why sometimes it's useful to show different maps to different people, and that's internationalization. So if you're in China and you're looking at a map of Beijing, you expect it all to be in Mandarin, right? But if I'm in the UK and looking to go to China, this isn't a lot of use for me. I need this. And so it turns out that this is a pretty pervasive problem, right? Like most of the major cities of the world actually have translations. Londra, London, even countries like Deutschland versus Germany and so on. Because these are actually images, you've got to actually re-render them with all the different languages. And so the net effect is, instead of having one set of tiles that has to go to every data center, you have like multiple sets. So now you're not just talking about 4 billion, you're talking about many, many more. And it was getting out of hand. So what did Google decide to do? They decided to do something which at the time seemed like utter madness, but was actually just hugely ambitious. They decided that rather than use this process, they believed that it was possible at that point to change this around so that instead of sending tiles to all the data centers, they would instead send a lightweight, stripped down copy of the raw map data, and then have code in the data centers dynamically draw every map tile at the point at which it was requested. Right? So every time you make a request to Google Maps, it will go, oh, right, you need red. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 tiles. Right? And in the process, get rid of all those problems, but take on a massive, massive engineering challenge. And that's kind of Google's approach to most things, really. So that's kind of cool, and it solved those problems. My job, though, as the product manager, was to think, well, how can I use this technology for the benefit of my audience? What would developers like? And what would, people who are designing websites, what would they love to be able to do that might now be possible because of this change in technology? And actually, there were a couple of things that just leapt out at us based on what we've been hearing and what was going on in the market. one of the things that we were hearing was that people were getting what they called Google Maps fatigue. In other words, every site, it used to be, there was a period around sort of 1996, 1997, when using a Google map on a website, putting your own data onto it, doing a mashup, as they called it, was kind of cool. It was like the new thing. And people loved it. But by the time we get to 2010, which is the period we're talking about here, it was kind of ubiquitous. There were Google Maps all over the internet. People had sort of seen them. And so now the cool new thing was to do maps that looked a little bit different, and which is not something that we could do. The second problem was that the Google map, as it stood at that time, the standard base map, is designed for the core use cases that Google Maps itself it is intended to tackle. And that's really about discovery and directions, right? It's about finding locations and businesses and figuring out how to get there. But that's not what people use the Maps API for. The Maps API is largely about data visualization. And data visualization has a different set of requirements. And one of those is that you don't want your map to be too cluttered, right? You don't want it to have irrelevant data on. You also don't want it to be distracting. So you look at this. This is a map that actually shows the growth of Walmart stores in the US over time. And you can see that colour is being used here as a key indicator of data. So if the map underneath it was also coloured, that would actually cause it to be much harder to read. So by desaturating the map underneath, we've made the data much clearer. Another thing is the basic idea. Oh, that's come out really dark. The basic idea is some people wanted to be able to, people who had a real strong design sense and cared greatly about the pixels on their website, they wanted to make sure that the map fit in with the overall house style of the site. So this is just an example I found, which is a map that helps you discover resources you'll need in a zombie apocalypse. And so they restyled the map essentially to make it feel a bit more edgy. But there's a bunch of examples of this where companies are like, well, our colour scheme for our website is, say, orange and black. And so we want the map to look a bit more like that. So we knew straight away there were some interesting use cases here, and a little bit of research and talking to users confirmed to us that this was the case. But also in this situation, your ambition can easily get ahead of what's technically possible. This is why it's good sometimes to have a bit of a technical grounding when you're making product decisions, because it was important to understand what the constraints are in the infrastructure that we have available to us. The first one is that for this whole system to work, those servers that generate those tiles had to respond in under 10 milliseconds. That was basically the performance requirements that Google placed on Google Maps. So we could not do anything that would risk it taking longer to draw those tiles than 10 milliseconds. And there are a couple of consequences of this. One of the main ones is that we were not allowed to increase the size of the data set that was in each data center. In other words, that mapping data that was stored there, that the map was derived from, we couldn't increase the size of that. Because if it got bigger, it would take longer to process. And that meant, for example, that we couldn't change the typefaces, right? Because the fonts themselves were in that data set. It also meant that we couldn't add content that wasn't displayed on a map. Wasn't already displayed on the map. So, for example, counties, right? This is the Devon flag, which is where I'm living. You might think that Google Maps shows counties, but if you actually look at it, it doesn't. Counties are not shown anywhere on Google Maps. Google has the data. It's in that massive database I mentioned before. They just chose not to include it on the map. As a result, it wasn't sent down to the data centers. So even if we wanted to draw counties, or someone asked us if we could draw counties, it wasn't possible. And in fact, this restriction called us out in a number of interesting ways, because it turns out that you might think, well, okay, you can't draw counties, but you can draw countries, right? Countries are shown on the map. Well, yes, that's true, but not the full outline of the country. The only thing that's shown on a Google map is the borders between countries on land. For the rest, you rely on the sea. So effectively, if you say to Google Maps, just show me the outlines of countries, you get this. Because that's just the land borders. Without the sea, you don't actually get a sense of the actual country. Iceland basically doesn't exist because it's an island. So there were this used to crop up in interesting ways where we're like, oh, well, we'll just do that. Oh, no, that data isn't there, and we're not allowed to change that. Okay, so we understood the constraints now. We understood what was possible. And now we had to figure out how to deliver this. And essentially what we're talking about is allowing you to choose how different types of feature on the map look. So the first thing to do is to come up with a taxonomy for to everything that's on the map. Now, some of this was influenced by the way it was stored in the database, but we also had some control about, and could ensure it was reasonably intuitive. But these are the kind of conversations you have, which are kind of fun, but can get surprisingly contentious. Like, how would you classify features on a map? We realized fairly quickly that we wanted to do a hierarchy. So we wanted to make sure that you could say, turn all roads red. Or just say, actually, just turn the motorways red. And then we had to figure out what that hierarchy looked like throughout all the different features that were there. This isn't the complete set, but it's just some of the tree that we built. You can see as you build it up, the map sort of fills in. So these are different categories we created of features that would be needed. Then we had to figure out, okay, so what controls are we going to give you to actually change the look and feel of these things? And this was actually trickier than we thought, because the natural instinct in this is like, well, we'll just let you colour them. We'll just let you say, roads are red, parks are green, etc., etc. It turns out that designing maps that look good is hard. There's a reason why cartography is both an art and a science. And if you let someone loose on the raw data, you will just get horrible looking maps. And we wanted it to be quick and easy to make maps look, ensure they still looked good, but shift them in the direction that people wanted to go. And so what I did was I tried to put myself in the mindset of a developer or a designer of a website that might want to do this. So what do designers use when they're designing? Well, they use Photoshop or something like it. And what they tend to do is they'll bring the map in and then they'll mess around with various controls and adjustment layers and so forth and figure out ways of making the map look good. And just by making adjustments, so for example, in this example, just saying, okay, I'm going to fix the hue to red across the map. You can see immediately that it looks red, but it's still very readable, it's still very usable. So we took inspiration from this, and rather than offer a set of tools to allow you to fix the color of different things, we basically offered a set of tools that allow you to apply these kinds of adjustments. To say, okay, I want to change the hue, I want to change the lightness, I want to change the saturation, and also some basic visibility controls as well. The next thing we have to figure out is, well, how do we represent that? So this is where it gets a little bit specific to developer products, because you're probably thinking when you think about designing products, you're thinking about what the user interface should look like. Well, the equivalent on a developer product is figuring out what the actual programmatic interface looks like. But it's a similar kind of mental exercise because you want it to be intuitive, you want it to be easy to understand and easy for developers to use. But it turns out that the amount of complexity we had to represent here made that quite difficult. Other things that were challenging was we realized that the order in which these transformations were applied was highly consequential to the output. You couldn't just say, well, I want to take roads and I want to make them red, I want to make them lighter, and I want to make them have a thicker lines or something like that. Because the order in which you did those three things had a significant impact. And so we ended up with this, well, I'll just be honest with you, really kind of nasty data structure. If you've done any programming, you're going to recognize this as like nested dictionaries inside lists, inside dictionaries. But it was the best we could do. And that's kind of the way it is. Sometimes you can't have the perfect thing. You just have to accept the compromises that are forced upon you and figure out a way to make that accessible. So now we've got our design. We figured out what the actual programmatic interface is going to look like. We figured out what the features are. We figured out what controls we're going to offer, so we can actually start building it. While the engineers are building it, I as a product manager need to worry about all the other things that you've got to worry about before you launch a product. And I'll just be honest with you and say the importance of some of these things changes as your company grows and as it gets bigger. So here's just sort of a short list of some of the things we worry about. Now, it's fair to say that Google in particular is quite sensitive to some of these issues, takes them very, very seriously. When you're a younger company, you can sometimes be a bit more relaxed, but Google had very, very strict processes in place to make sure that new products respected user privacy, were secure, weren't going to overload the infrastructure, and so on. And so this involves basically going around and collecting approvals from all the different people who manage those systems, and having conversations with them and making sure that you're prepared and that they're comfortable. In this case, it wasn't too difficult because we weren't handling user data, so we didn't have to worry too much about privacy. We weren't launching new systems, we were just launching a change in the behavior of an existing system, so security was not a major concern, that had already been covered. We had to confirm that generating a styled map didn't require more compute power than a regular map. because if it did, then we would have to worry about overall system capacity. But fortunately it didn't, so we were good there. Legal was an interesting one. You might think, well, what are the legal ramifications of messing around with a map? Well, the problem is, if you've got a map and it shows a railway line on it, and then you let someone take that railway line off the map, does that create a risk, right? Is there a possibility that someone will accidentally drive into that railway line, not realizing it's there? But actually, we had conversations with the legal team, and they felt comfortable that the use cases that we were looking to cater to would likely change the map sufficiently that users would recognize this is not a standard Google map. The likelihood that people would actually make really tiny changes to the Google map but leave it looking otherwise so familiar that you'd think it's the same thing was very, very low. Marketing is another interesting one. There's two sides to that. One is, okay, how are we going to market the product? Obviously, that's something you always have to worry about. But there's also what impact does this have on our marketing position? And there was a concern initially that actually Google Maps is a branding element of Google. It's an instantly recognizable thing. And that those pixels that people dedicate to a Google map on their website are actually really valuable real estate that Google have access to. So allowing them to mess with it was a bit worrying. Like, if we let people start changing the maps on the web so they don't look like Google Maps anymore, have we shot ourselves in the foot from a brand awareness perspective? Well, what you may have noticed from some of the examples I've given you is that even with the changes that we were offering, you can still tell it's a Google map. Some of those restrictions, like the typefaces and the way in which the roads were styled, the line thickness, that sort of thing, they alone are sufficiently distinctive, but mentally you go, I recognise this. Plus you've still got the logo in the bottom right corner, so that was fine. The last one was pricing. Pricing is always a big and complicated conversation, and the basic conversation we had to have in this instance was, are we going to limit access to this feature to only people who are paying for it? Which was a kind of controversial position to take at the time. We had a bit of a debate over that. The engineers were strongly opposed to that idea because they wanted their work to be seen by as broad an audience as possible. Obviously, the commercial team thought this was an interesting and compelling thing that might be a differentiating feature for paying customers. But ultimately, we decided that this product was never going to succeed unless people saw it. And what I mean by that is people's expectations of what you can do on a website with Google Maps are heavily driven by what they've seen elsewhere, what they've seen on Google Maps itself, which wasn't using this feature, and what they've seen on other people's websites that use Google Maps. So we needed to drive adoption to create kind of an accelerating cycle of growth. And if we limited this to a relatively small number of paying customers, it was just never going to happen. It wasn't going to be worth launching. So these are all conversations I had to have with all these different parties to get to the point where we can actually launch the thing. In the meantime, our tech writers were documenting it. Documentation is a funny thing because you could argue that if your product needs extensive documentation, then it's probably too hard to use. Also, sitting with a tech writer while they write documentation is really insightful. You can learn a lot about whether your product actually is easy or whether it's any good, basically. If a product is hard to document, it's almost certainly hard to use. But if you look at something like a mobile app, they don't even have documentation now. But developer products, it's essential. And so the tech writer was writing documentation, then he would send it to me, I would review it, give him comments and feedback, and ultimately it was my job as the product manager to sign off and say, this is correct and it's ready to go out the door. Also, I mentioned kind of another part of the launch is messaging, right? It's what's your go-to-market strategy. So it's things like drafting the announcements that went on the Google blogs, writing kind of demos that would show the feature off that could be shared with the media. Is there other things that were on my plate? In the process of doing this, I realized something. I realized it about a week before launch when I was writing all this content and I was writing this demo. And that was that this product was too hard to use. That data structure I showed you at the beginning, or a few slides ago, was too complex for anybody to rationally get their head around and be creative with. In short, this product was simply not going to succeed if it didn't have some kind of tool that would allow people to experiment, to play with the designs, to try things out. The problem was we had no time, and we had no available engineers to build such a thing. This product was due to launch at Google's big developer conference, Google I/O, in 2010. Everybody in the whole company was flat out preparing for that event. And me coming along 5 days beforehand and saying, if you just build a whole new user-facing tool, is that okay? It was just a lost cause. So by this point, I was in the States ready for the conference, and I was staying at a hotel just next to the conference center. And I was like, this is tricky. Because I know that this isn't going to be worth doing without this, but I also know there's no way I can make it happen. So I didn't have much choice, I just had to write it myself. And that's kind of indicative of what happens when you're a product manager. Sometimes you just got to do what needs to be done. I'm not a great developer. I'm certainly not a Google class developer, but I could probably hack something together that would get us by. So I holed myself up in this hotel for a weekend. I literally didn't leave my room other than to go and get a pizza and bring it back. I sat on a bed that looked like that, and I just knocked out JavaScript like my life depended on it for about 48 hours, including a terrifying moment at about 10 o'clock on Sunday night when I hit a bug and I had no idea how to fix it, and was really, really about to throw in the towel. Bearing in mind the thing was launching on Tuesday, and at the end of it, spat this thing out. It ain't pretty, but it worked. And basically it was just a tool, just a wizard to allow you to mess around and try out different styles. And I wrote this and I thought, it'll do for now. Once I get back to Sydney, I'll get someone who knows what they're doing, a proper engineer, to rewrite it and make it good. This thing was unlaunched and replaced with a better version 3 months ago. They were using it for 6 years. So there's another lesson for you, is there's no such thing as this will do, I'll come back to it later, because you just never come back to it later. So I got this thing working, and at that point it was the first time that we as a team could really just rapidly iterate over different variations and play with different versions of the map and check this thing worked. And it mostly worked. There's one exception. One of the key use cases I mentioned earlier was just desaturate the map, get the colours out of the way so that you can visualize data on top of it. And when I did that on a map of San Francisco, I got this. And I was like, what? What are those things doing? So it turns out that these little things, these shields, these road shields, they are a special case. The map is drawn from a set of vector data, but road shields are just tiny little GIF images that are placed on top at the very, very end of the rendering process. And nobody ever considered the possibility that we might want to change the colour of them. But you can't launch a map, you can't launch a product where you say you can completely desaturate the map, except for these little spots of red and blue all over the US. So I discover this, when that tool is finished, I discover it on Sunday night. We're launching on Tuesday afternoon. So I drop an email to the team in Seattle who own the back end that renders the map tiles, and I'm like, okay, we have a problem here. Can you help? And you remember what I said a minute ago about how everybody being flat out and there being no engineers? That's exactly what I got back. It's like, sorry, can't help, too busy. Now this is not one where I could fix it myself, not in a million years. Because it might seem such a little thing, but actually it was a really complex thing to fix, because we're not talking about, oh, we've overlooked something in the styling process. We're saying, actually, there's a whole different class of data that we haven't accommodated, that we have to figure out how to style. We have to start recoloring sort of sprite images. So Monday I get up and they're like, no, sorry, can't help. So I'm like, okay, this is not good. So I get on the phone to the director of engineering in the Seattle office, whose team or one of the teams I'm in owns this stuff, and I'm like, we really need some help with this. And he said, I understand, but I just don't have anybody. I said, look, here's the demo, play with it, see what you think. And he played with it for a bit, and he was like, yeah, that's not good. He said, all right, leave it with me, I'll see what I can do. So Tuesday morning comes around, and I wake up and I'm like, okay, how's this going to go? And I get an email that just said, couldn't find any engineers, stayed up late, fixed it myself. So in the end, the engineering director, who not generally in the business of writing code anymore, just thought, nothing for it, I'll just do it myself. And again, it's a good example of the kind of things you have to do, right? That's the kind of relationships you need to build, where you can have those phone calls and have those different conversations, and the person on the other end of the phone doesn't think, who's this guy and why is he causing me so much grief? They think, I know him, he means well, he cares about his product, I'll see what I can do. So, doc's written, system works, demo written, we can actually launch the thing. This is not a great slide, but it's essentially, if you go online, you can actually watch the video of the event at the conference where we actually announced all this. And it was just super exciting. Like, it was the result of six months of work, and a lot of pain, a lot of jumping through hoops, a lot of last-minute crises. And just to get it out there and see people get excited about it was just really, really compelling. And even to this day, it still makes me smile thinking about it. In fact, when I was preparing this presentation earlier today, I went onto the website of the San Francisco Intercontinental Hotel to see if I could find a picture of it, the picture I showed you earlier. And what do you know? They're using style maps. This like totally made my day. It's like, it's all come back around. But even that doesn't make me smile as much as this, which clearly justifies the whole project. This is Yara Maps, which is genius. I recommend you try it. It's basically just turns Google Maps into Pyro Maps. It's brilliant. All right. So that's my story of one launch. Right? That's one product. I reckon, I counted up when I left that team, that in the course of 3 years working on that product, I did about 40 launches. And not all of them was as dramatic as that. Some of them were simpler, and some of them were more complex. But it's a continuous process of improvement, and every product launch has its own little foibles and its own little things you have to worry about. All right, so, that having all been said, if that sounds like hell on earth to you, then you don't want to be a product manager. But if that sounds kind of like exciting and fun, then you might. And so just a couple of things I want to mention as to why I think it's it's an interesting job, it's an exciting job, and I would definitely recommend it. This is another one of those little video clips. This is a guy, a friend of mine who's a product manager at Dewdill, who are a London-based startup that provide information about companies. So they provide basically services for you to help you understand the performance of the company, the size of it, various other things. And I sat down with him and asked him a similar set of questions. And again, I thought it was a good quote.
So it's really seeing, I mean, if you want to kind of summarize it in one action or whatever, it's seeing the smile on people's faces when you've solved their problem. There's nothing better than seeing that happen. I think there's a lot of work that goes into building something, but during that journey you learn so much about the problem you're solving, who you're solving it for, and working with a team is one of the best things you can do. It is working towards a common goal, but not necessarily it being predefined. It's not in a sort of agency model. Someone doesn't say, I want an e-commerce website built. It's, hey, here's a problem, how can we fix it? And in that regard, it's quite a creative role as well as one where you have to hunker down as much as you can. Yeah.
All right. So you've probably got this impression already, but one of the nice things I think about it, and again, something that it has in common with sort of leadership roles that you might be interested in, is you end up working with an awful number of teams. You work with a lot of interesting people. They're all very different. They all think differently. They all, they all worry about different things. They're all motivated in different ways. And you are essentially the universal translator. Right? When the legal team comes to you and says, sorry, but this website is not compliant with this regulation, you need to fix it. You have to go back to the engineering team and you have to explain to them what changes they need to make and why that's important in their language. And if it turns out there's some challenges there, you have to be able to go back to the legal team and say, we can't do that, but we can do this for you. Will that do? And you tend to do a lot of that kind of that translation. And that's why, in a sense, the kind of most critical character type of a good product manager is empathy. It's the ability to empathize with not just your customers, but also the people you work with, and adjust your communication style to suit them. It also means that you learn a little bit of all these things. Right? You learn a little bit about marketing, a little bit about sort of things you have to worry about from a legal perspective, a little bit about engineering, a little bit about design. So you end up with a very broad, rounded skill set. You're by no means an expert, but it puts you in a very strong position if, as you say, if you do end up running a company one day. So I basically thought, well, you might think, well, how have I never heard this role? Does anybody I care about ever hire these people? So I just went onto one of the main sort of job search websites, put in product manager, and then filled this slide with logos until I ran out of room. This is not just a list I made up. These are people who are genuinely recruiting product managers in the UK, at least at the time I wrote this slide, which was a couple of months ago. Most of the big technology companies that you've heard of now have significant product manager departments. And then, in terms of kind of long-term options, where can it take you? There's just a wealth of them. I mentioned a lot of people go and start their own startups. You can move into the larger companies. That's always an interesting experience, working for someone like Google or Facebook. Also, as I mentioned, executive leadership. You tend to find that product managers tend to be seen as sort of people who can move into other companies in senior roles because they have that broad experience. It's also a very transferable role. So it's a role where you can basically do it in pretty much any country that has a technology sector. And that was why it was so easy for me to start in Australia, move to the States, then move back here. It's very easy to move around. In fact, Google actually encouraged their product managers to move around. They think that cross-pollination of ideas between offices is important, and product management is the only role at Google where every 6 months they send everybody in the company a survey that starts with, would you be interested in working abroad? And if you say yes, they ask you what countries, you say that one, that one, that one, that one, and they start sending you jobs. And if you decide you want one, then they pick you up and all your stuff, and they ship you abroad to do that job somewhere else. Worth mentioning, it pays well. You tend to find sort of commensurate with the sort of salaries you'd expect of an engineering role, and they're fairly in-demand people. So this is just some salary data admittedly from a few years back. I do need to update this. There has been it's just very recently some updated numbers. But I've adjusted it for inflation, and it does sort of match my expectations when I'm hiring, just as to what what people might expect. Okay, so in summary, this is a role that offers you both responsibility and a degree of autonomy. You're in control of your own destiny. You're making decisions for what your team should work on. You're helping people, which is always a nice feeling. You're solving real problems. What you're doing is important, like worthwhile. I mean, it has a real impact on people's lives. You get to work with lots of interesting people. You develop a very broad, very transferable skill set. You get, and something I probably should have stressed earlier, but you do have this unique perspective on everything that's going on around the product. You tend to find that people in other roles, particularly in engineering, they get quite frustrated because they don't feel like they really understand why certain decisions are being made. And that isn't the case in product management. You see the whole thing, good and bad. And you have this sort of great set of long-term options. Okay, so lastly, just before we wrap up, how might you become a product manager if you were interested in doing it? Let's say we'll race through this because it may not be directly relevant to you, but most of the large technology firms now have dedicated recruitment and training programs for graduates and undergraduates. A lot of these, to be honest with you, are templated on the way Google approached it. They were really the company that kicked off this idea of an associate product management scheme, and that's now highly respected and worked out very well. It's been almost cloned, almost identically at Yahoo. Facebook has something called the RPM, Rotational Product Management Program. And one of the defining things about these graduate schemes is that you rotate through a number of different teams. So you'll do 6 months or 12 months in one team, and then you'll move into another team, often in another office, often in another country, as part of the program, and you'll get training, and you'll get international trips and various other things. But you may not fancy the idea of working for a big company, and there's a growing demand for product managers within startups as well. And so if that's more your scene, then there are a few places you can look. Working startups is probably the best place to start in the UK. It does look like it was built in 1998, but it does work. AngelList is becoming increasingly the go-to place for people who want to recruit high-quality technical people. I wouldn't recommend LinkedIn except as a last resort because the signal-to-noise ratio on there is very high. So if you do apply for a job on LinkedIn, then you've got to really work hard to stand out from the crowd. And this is kind of a new site. Mind the Product essentially are an organisation that have become the de facto product management community worldwide. They run all the big events. They run monthly meetups as well called Product Tank that happen all over the world, including in London. And they've also got a jobs board that they've launched recently. So I used to kind of talk through for other audiences how you might apply for a job, what you can expect. I've sort of cut that out again because I don't think it's directly relevant, but if that's something you're interested in, feel free to come and ask me later. But I just will mention kind of the sorts of things that you might expect to be interviewed about if you go for a product job. It's kind of these are sort of the standard shape of a product manager interview. So it's product instincts. Do you recognise what a good product is and how to build one? Do you have a good sense of design, of good design versus bad? Do you have analytical skills? Can you do estimation? Do you understand the importance of data and data gathering? Do you have some core technical competency to understand and communicate with engineers? And how do you think strategically? Do you think about how you essentially ensure that you balance the value proposition of a product between the audience and the company developing it? If this is something you're interested in learning more about, then the shortcut is to get hold of this book, which I am not involved in and I'm not on commission for, but it's a really good kind of just basic guide to how product interviews tend to be structured and how you do well in them. And also, there's this great site called the Peer Interview, which is a great place to practice. Basically, it will just fire questions at you with a timer until you curl up and die. If you want more details, if you want more information, this is the website that I put together that goes with this presentation. It includes more details on some of the things I've talked about. It includes copies of the presentations I've done at previous events, which is say includes some of this content that I haven't included today. It also includes those videos I mentioned and a bunch of additional reading material if you're interested in following up. And this presentation, if for some strange reason you want to watch it again, will be up there fairly soon. And that is all I have. Thank you.